All right. It is time for another Dude Diligence. I guess it's a video cast, really, because my face is on it. Today, I'm being joined by an amazing human being that I met probably 3 weeks ago. And I want to actually make sure I say her name right, even though I see it right on the screen here. Dr. Eleanor Haspel-Portner. I'm just going to introduce her, or bring her on, actually, and let her introduce herself.
Hi,
You know what?
Sean.
Hi. And you know what? I've never actually asked you how you like to be addressed. Is it Dr. Eleanor? Is it how do you prefer to be addressed?
Either Dr. Eleanor or Eleanor.
Okay. Excellent.
Some of my clients call me Dr. Eleanor. Some of them call me Eleanor. Doesn't matter to me.
All right. I'll call you one of the two, or I'll vary.
Okay.
Anyway, I want you to tell, because I know a bit already, and we've had several conversations already, and some of the things that you've said to me over the last couple of weeks have hit me with so much truth that's why we're here. I want to make sure that you're sharing what you know, what you've experienced. But I want to start from the beginning, like your background prior to human design, your interests, like you come with a very impressive set of credentials, background. When we get to talking about punch cards, I am going to definitely probably interrupt you and just talk about how badass that was, like how much tenacity it takes to do that. So, but I'm going to stop talking and let you.
Okay. My journey really began when I was a child, and my first memory of seeing auras and not having the people around me recognize what I was responding to. So, for whatever the reason, I didn't turn off seeing auras, but I turned off talking about them or giving nonverbal messages about what I was feeling or experiencing based on them. So I was always sensitive and looking for answers that were not ordinary answers. When I was 11, one of my sisters, I'm the youngest of 5, one of my sisters gave me The Little Prince to read. And that has always been one of my favorite books. Of course, we studied it when I took French in college. And again, I reviewed it when I needed to take a language exam for my PhD. But that book tuned me into soul and let me know that I wasn't alone in wanting to be related to in terms of my soul. That same sister gave me Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Carl Jung when I was about 15. And that book, again, opened a door. So when I went to college, and I wasn't sure if there would even be enough money for me to go to college, I went to a city college in New York, and I had a scholarship. I was a good student. I did it in 3.5 years, and I applied to University of Chicago. It was then called the Committee on Human Development. It was an interdisciplinary department that studied psychology, biology, anthropology, and sociology. And I didn't know at the time, but I know now that it was my introduction to the 4 worlds. The different orientations of that department, which was the first integrative social science department in the world. And I was studying with some of the best people like Bruno Bettelheim. Carl Rogers came out of the same department. Tom Gordon, who taught parent effectiveness training came out of that department. And I mention him, Tom, because he became a friend, and parent effectiveness training was one of the tools that I began to use when my education as a psychologist didn't translate to my being a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so the University of Chicago and my PhD was a huge part of my evolution. I was very a good student. And at the end of the first year, I asked one of my professors if I could read Jung, because at that time nobody was teaching or reading Jung. And John said to me, "What will you want me to do?" And I said, "All I want is permission to give you a reading list. I'll read the books and I'll tell you what they say." So he said, "Okay." The same time I was teaching to make more money and a research associate, I watched some of my professors fudge data. I watched some of them use drugs. And I remember saying to somebody, "Why would I use drugs when I like my consciousness the way it is?"
Mm-hmm.
So my education was very broad. I did a dissertation that was a very innovative one. I had 295 variables, and that's why you're talking about punching cards.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the computer was in a building, and I would have to punch the cards for all the data. Um, One of my dissertation people was a statistician. So I had a standing appointment and I would do the statistics and I'd run it by him and he'd tell me what to do next. Then I'd go punch cards. One baby on each lap in a computer room punching cards that then I would submit. And the computer was in a big building and I would have to come back middle of the night to get the output.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I was a pretty disciplined student. And my dissertation was on um, religiosity, family interaction patterns, child rearing, child guilt. And it was the first study that looked for causation and also interviewed the children as well as the parents. And I
Mm-hmm.
had 83 families in my data.
Wow.
No big uh, findings came out of that study, but it taught me how to do research and how to analyze multiple variables that showed causation and, big statistical study. And then I realized that I didn't like teaching. I taught college for 3 years. I taught testing, personality, adult development, and intro. And I didn't like teaching and just training people to teach and do research. So I decided to go back and do a postdoctoral internship, which I did at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago. And um, during my internship, I worked a lot with children, I worked a lot with adults, and I gathered enough hours to get licensed. And in January of 1974, I both got licensed as a psychologist and I was already in training as a Jungian analyst. And I sat one night, um, and this is just my story. So I'm going from my background into my story, if that's
Yeah.
okay.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So I was sitting one night asking, of what am I afraid? I had two children young and had divorced my husband. Now, retrospectively, I can see that our values differed, and that the key in relationships is values, especially spiritual values. If you're not spiritually aligned, your relationship's not going to work. Just simple. So I was sitting asking of what am I afraid? And I had a direct experience of God. A light came at me, and I was shown that I was afraid of death. I was afraid because at the moment of death, all of our memories of this life are wiped out, and we become a tabula rasa. And at the same time, I was shown about religion, I was shown about relationships, and I was shown about my own consciousness. So that was a very defining moment for me, because at the time I was writing a book on my dissertation, and one of my dissertation people was a publisher. So I not only was writing a book, but I had a publisher. And he had just said to me, "You're the expert in this in the country. You need to write this book." And after my Kundalini experience, I didn't know it was a Kundalini experience at the time, but I was shown about relationships, and I wrote an outline in that state of being and sent it off to a publisher. And it was entitled Marriage in Trouble, A Time of Decision. Because when I was going through the decision making of a divorce, there was nothing written to help people make a decision. And so I shifted gears and wrote this book. It was published in 1976, and I started a private practice, not knowing that people didn't do that. I had no income, I had no backup money. I was basically alone in Chicago, and I started practice. And I, at the same time, was having all of these experiences of consciousness, repeated Kundalini experiences, and all of my psychic abilities came back in, and I remembered. So I needed to get trained. I was seeing things in people I didn't want to see. I was sitting one day at the airport with my mother in Phoenix, and the lady at the next table was going to die within 24 hours. And I looked at my mother and I said, "What do I do with this? What do I do?" And I started crying. I mean, it was too much. So I spent about 5 years learning how to control it, how not to see if I didn't want to see, how to see if I wanted to, how to see when I was with clients and not see when I was out on the street. So, you know, I was in private practice. I was having all of these experiences. I was in training as a Jungian analyst, and I began asking people, "Have you ever had numinous experiences?" I asked Joseph Campbell when I attended a 2-day seminar with him at UCLA, and I said, "So Joseph, have you ever had numinous experiences?" And he said, "No." I thought, how can you be teaching what you haven't experienced?
And are you saying humanistic experiences?
Numinous. In other words, a direct experience of a higher power.
Oh, that's numinous? Okay. Cool.
Where you know, the world opens and your consciousness opens and you know more than you know. So I was in practice. My practice was very busy. I started doing groups, and I was told in a meditation, and I also met my mentor astrologer, Catherine DeJersey. I met her in 1973. She told me at the time that I shouldn't sign a lease on an office in Chicago because I'd move. I told her she was crazy. But then in 1976, at a Jungian conference in California, I knew I was home.
Hmm.
And I decided to move from Chicago, give up I had a very busy practice with a waiting list, and I had just released my book, published it, and I moved. I took my kids and I moved from Chicago to California and started over. And the following year, I was told in a meditation to go to India. And I did. And there I met my husband. I went to Osho's ashram.
Hmm.
I had no interest in the ashram, but I was told to go by a voice. Uh, so I went, and I met Marvin on the day and time my mentor astrologer told me I'd meet someone.
Hmm.
And I had forgotten that. But when I got home, I found a little piece of paper I had stuck in a book that said, you'll meet someone.
Hmm.
Uh, so um, that was 1978, August of 78. Marvin and I met. We've been together since the day we met in India. And he came back. He had given up his medical practice and was not planning to come back because he didn't want to do herd medicine. He wanted to be a doctor who could talk to a patient, who could diagnose by listening. And I was already a second degree Reiki person. I met Mrs. Takata in 1977 by
Hmm.
chance. My office mate said to me, before you move to California, go check out this Reiki. Maybe it's something, I think they're doing with their hands what you can see. So I went, and the first night I put my hands, and the next morning I woke up and I could see without my glasses.
Hmm.
And I was very myopic.
Hmm.
So I knew there was something there, and I was already working with energy. And Marvin and I did groups. I was doing therapy groups every 6 weeks for 10 years. And um, there were always 30 to 40 people in the group. Uh, and it was a whole weekend. So now when I look back with what I know now versus what I knew then when I was doing all of that work, was that I was collecting data.
Hmm.
I was collecting what worked in different modalities, in different worlds. And I didn't really realize it at the time. But I had studied PET to learn how to deal with my children when they were acting out. But that wasn't sufficient when I was working with couples
Hmm.
or when I was working with an individual. I needed other skills. So I was a sex therapist trained by Masters and Johnson. I was a hypnotherapist and president of the Los Angeles um, Society for Clinical Hypnosis and founded the LA Erickson Institute. Uh, but hypnosis didn't do the whole thing.
Hmm.
Uh, so in 1996, I saw the mandala of the human design in the Mountain Astrologer magazine, and I immediately knew what it was.
Hmm.
Um, any questions to this point, Sean?
So many. I mean, I just wanted like break your first sentence about seeing auras and just like what does that look like? But we can park that for now. Um,
I can tell you what it looks like if you want me to.
I would because I have a friend who she described it of what she sees and how she does it, and I can't emulate it, but I know that humans can do it. So yeah, I'm looking for another angle.
Um, for those people who are on the call who are human design people, um, it's the 5818
Okay.
in my chart that is a gift of knowing frequency. And so when I first began, when I see auras, I sense it as a frequency, and what it looks like is something that's sort of moving in the person's energy field. And it has a different, the spacing and the coloring and the speed with which it moves are all factors that go into what it is I see.
Okay.
I can see it with colors. I can see it colorless. I can see it um, when somebody's talking to me. If what they're saying is not what their frequency shows, there's a dissonance.
Mm.
And a lot of times that has to do with which world they're in.
Mm-hmm.
So um, there was a lot for me to learn about seeing auras when I began to remember and see it in my practice. I needed to validate when it was real and when it was hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. So,
And
oh, go ahead.
no, ask your question.
I was going to say, so I kind of lost it there, but the thread was you had this background, this experience. You knew you could see them, you could sense it. I imagine at some point we'll get talking about human design for sure, but like at some point you sort of saw this blueprint that goes, aha, that's that 5818 is where that's coming from.
Well, the reason I'm saying that is because it's when I was teaching with Ra, and I was teaching about the dream and what it is. The 5818 is the channel of judgment, work on what has been spoiled. It's knowing a frequency, and it is not a personality issue. No channel tells you what a personality issue would be for a person.
Hmm.
Cosmic energy doesn't work that way. Astrological energy doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that the 5818 is for me where I sense frequency and where I know if what a person is saying to me is true.
Right.
And so um, when I saw the human design mandala in 1996, I immediately called the phone number,
Mm-hmm.
and I got Chaitanya on the phone. And he and Zeno were New Sunwear America, and they were the teachers in America,
Hmm.
authorized by Ra.
What year was
And
this? This was
1996, March of 1996.
okay.
And I said to Chaitanya, how do I learn this? And he said, well, by chance, Zeno's in LA teaching this weekend. And I said, well, it's too late for me to get into that class. Would she teach me privately? And he said, let me see. And she did. So she came to my home over a weekend and
Yeah.
taught me beginning human design. At that time, there was no computer program that was available,
Mm-hmm.
and we had to color our own designs.
Which must be fairly empowering and cementing. Like if just aside, John, like I've met a fellow here that does laser cutting of wood and builds like puzzles. And I've been thinking about talking to him, like, what a great opportunity to go, here's the body graph. This is your colors. This is what this means, right? Like you could teach it to children by anyway. It's I I feel like I lack that foundation, partly my busy brain and the way I
Well, it may be a good thing, Sean, because the single human design chart is incomplete.
right.
It's not a complete system. So, what happened was I studied with Zeno, and I was very impressed with some of the information. Now remember, I also already had studied the Kabbalah. I already had studied astrology. Uh, I was already a psychologist, so I knew development and developmental sequences in development. And I didn't resonate with being a manifester.
Mm.
I'll just say that much. I
So that
kept
was that's
asking
what the
questions.
mm.
I kept asking questions. So, in any case, I studied human design, and um, it seemed to have some missing pieces of synthesis that I'd always been involved in.
Hmm.
So, I, um, I believe it was May, April, May, maybe it was May of that year that Rod came to America to teach um, circuits. And it was the first time he was going to talk about circuits, which, by the way, did not really hold up scientifically in the data
Mm.
when I tested it. Um, so I went to the class. It was a 4 day class, 5 day class, maybe. And there was an exam afterwards to certify you as an analyst.
Mm.
And when I first got there, um, we actually gave Chaitan a ride from the airport to the meeting venue. And I turned and I said, "What kind of name is that?" And he said, "I'm a sannyasin." So we were sannyasin from having been to India. And
Right.
that, and many of the early human design people were people who had been in Osho's ashram in Oregon
Hmm.
and had followed Ra after Osho died in 1990. So
Oh.
they transferred. Uh, Osho died January 20th, 1990.
Mm.
And Ra had a lot of a lot of Osho's people. Anyhow, I
Hmm.
spent a day with Ra asking him about my chart, my husband's chart, my children's charts, my mother's chart, my and I had already begun doing some astrological calculations and seeing if they would explain some things that the human design chart didn't explain. Um, Ra didn't want any part of anything astrological. He was not an astrologer.
Hmm.
So I continued studying. I asked him, uh, I don't have all the dates down pat, but the next time I saw him, I asked him, it was a class where he had made a profile. And I asked him if he would like to visit LA and we could get him all the readings he wanted. And so he took us up on the offer and came and stayed with us for a couple of weeks. And while he was there, he told us all about his life. He liked to tell stories and he liked to talk. And Ra was a scam artist.
Mm.
He told us that in no uncertain terms, that what he did before human design, before the voice, was to sell people things that didn't exist,
Mm.
especially old people.
Mm.
And he had left um, his home um, in Canada and had disappeared for 7 years. And he went to Ibiza, claimed that he lived in a tree. He didn't. He lived in a little place, like a shack or whatever. Um, and that's where he was given the human design download.
Hmm.
Um, he told me once we were working together and were business partners, and I had a lot of information that nobody else had. Um, he told me that because I asked, I'm trying to think how to organize this, But
When-
when he spent time with us um, in 1999, giving us everything the voice told him, um, he gave me what he called the dream rave, which is a 15-gate matrix. All the voice told him was when we sleep, we move into a different matrix. And it's the matrix that animals have. And
mhm,
animals are horizontal, and when we sleep, we are horizontal.
right.
But that did not explain the sleep architecture or the fact that dogs and cats and other mammals dream and
Hmm.
have rapid eye movement when they do dream. So put the dream stuff on hold
Hmm.
and come back to my relationship with Ra.
Hmm.
So I said to him, I've noticed that when people have a defined sacral center in their waking chart and they lose it when they sleep, it's very different than when they don't have it and they gain it. And he couldn't grasp that
Hmm.
because he couldn't see that there was more than one design. He didn't have the worlds. So I kept working. Get in the early days, so we're talking 1996 into 1997 into 1998. I wasn't sure I wanted to continue working with him. I found things in the human design that were erroneous. I found some of the things, his behavior, not very loving and not supportive of consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, and I wanted not to have anything to do with him. So
Hmm.
I had pulled away, and then I got a phone call, interestingly enough, from Chaitan, asking if Marvin and I would host Ra for a couple of weeks so he could earn money to go back to Ibiza because he was bankrupt.
Right.
And we didn't really want anything to do with him because he is a scam artist and a crook. But the message in the human design system was valid enough that we said yes.
Hmm.
And so he came and offered us, after spending a couple of days, he said, I would like to be your business partner. I would like it to be legal. I would like you to do a professional organization and do a study to see the science of human design.
Hmm.
Is it valid? Is it a valid system? Um, I wasn't thrilled about doing it, but Marvin, my husband, is a medical doctor, and he said yes, we would be interested. So that meant that I took on doing the study. So we spent at least 2 or more weeks with Ra recording everything the voice told him. And I have those tapes and I have them all transcribed.
Really?
Um, yes. Um, and I agreed. We had a legal partnership. Um, and shortly after we signed the agreement, it turned out that he was double dipping. He was wanting to collect from me and then market it and collect elsewhere. I don't do business like that.
Hmm.
Um, and he was working with people he said he didn't want to work with, and he was doing things behind our back.
Hmm.
So I don't do business that way. I don't, I'm a scientist. I want it to have integrity, have truth, and be verifiable.
Hmm.
So um, we were in business with Ra starting in 1999. I taught the first class on the Dream Rave in November 1999.
Oh, wow.
Um, and when we got into the car after I taught about the Dream Rave, Ross said to me, okay, now I can Now I know what this is. I can make up some keynotes. So he didn't know what the dream rave was. He didn't understand that it was the calculation you get for the spiritual layer and dimension of a person, prenatally, natally. And it is the matrix that happens when we sleep. But when we dream, we move into a 64-gate matrix with those pathways connecting, because we know scientifically that during REM sleep, from a sleep architecture standpoint, there is carryover between the parts of the brain that are active during sleep and the cortex, which is active during waking life. So the reason we don't remember dreams is because consciousness is state specific. And when we're sleeping, we're in a different state than when we're awake. So the fact that during REM, there is carryover between the different matrices means that we have partial recollection.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can piece more of it together with inner work. So the dream rave was one of the first cues that I had that there was a lot more to design than what met the eye. So I was working with Ra and validating. I don't know how many variables I ended up with in the human design statistics, but what I tested was I tested every single variable in the human design system. I tested type, gates, channels, circuits, matrices. What else did I test? Oh, I had 5 matched samples, 30,000 cases. I had general population, AIDS patients, heart attack patients, fibromyalgia patients, and what are AIDS, heart attack, addiction is what I was missing.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 5 groups, matched samples, and I tested every single variable in the human design that Ron mentioned, down to colors, tones, and bases. Because as I tested, I kept showing Ra the output and saying, Ra, this doesn't hold up. Where will I find it? And he said, look here. So I'd look there, and then I'd come back to him and say, this doesn't show it. Where should I look next?
Mm-hmm.
So I tested every single variable in the human design system using the statistical package for the social sciences, doing a multivariate analysis of variance with factor analyses and rotational factor analyses, which I'm pleased to say centers held.
Mm-hmm.
The factor analyses of the centers showed that the centers had valid information. The channels did not factor analyze well. Neither, and colors, tones, and bases had no validity at all.
Oh, wow.
Profile has validity from a mathematical standpoint, but the interpretation given to it is not correct.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got the statistics, the part that held the best was type. But instead of 4 types, there are 5 types.
Yeah.
Because on Z tests that show reliability and whether there's a distinct difference between the groups, those showed up as statistically significant. So I can say without any doubt, statistically, type is valid.
Cool.
5 types, are valid. And I broke with Ra in 2002 because he did not want me teaching about the truth, and he did not want to be open-minded in reframing any of the information to follow the science.
Mm-hmm.
And as a social scientist, I needed to speak the truth. And he literally told me, you talk about five types because you're talking the truth, but I'm going to keep saying there are four because my ego won't let me say there are five.
Wow, he said that, eh?
He
And
actually said that in a phone conversation to me.
yeah, and
Um,
that clocks for me based on certain things that I see and hear, right? And I'm sure at some point you're going to talk about just how many people are potentially, well, not potentially, are manifesting generators. And I know,
Actually, 95% of the population are manifesting generators. And one of the things that happened was that after I got the statistics and said, here's the statistics on type, I can stand behind this, but I don't stand behind the interpretation on profile or certain other things because they don't hold up. Um, the human design people in the community wanted me to release statistics on percentages for centers. And I refused because the percentages of that came up did not validate any of what Ross said about open or closed centers.
mm,
In other words, if you have an open heart center, it does not mean that you're going to have more heart attacks.
mm,
I tested 500 people who died of heart attacks versus people who didn't.
mm,
And there was no statistical significance between open or closed heart centers.
sure.
So, as a social scientist doing the research, I needed to stand behind the truth of what statistics show,
Mm-hmm.
not the truth of an interpretation of what somebody said about a body graph.
Mm-hmm.
And it raised many questions for me, which is why I didn't go public sooner with the truth. I needed to do my own research and develop my own system that I could stand behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I did was, and this is in my Cosmic Secrets book, is that um, this guy, Noble, all my websites are named after him. He worked with me when I was doing groups, and he would put his paw on the person who I needed to work on next. And then he'd look at me. And everybody who met him got a cat. So when
Mm-hmm.
he died at age 22, my vet friend said, if you've never had kittens, have a litter of kittens. 13 cats later,
Wow.
we had kittens. And I had a litter of 6 kittens, and we had a set of twins. So we had precise to the second birth data
Mm-hmm.
on 6 homegrown mammals. So if Ra was right, those kittens should have been able to show me the physiologic difference between them, because one died at age 10 of cardiomyopathy and the other one lived to age 18 and was
Mm-hmm.
healthy. Cardiomyopathy is a genetic predisposition in cats, and because I had their birth time, I decided to use them to find additional matrices within the human design system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and to find the sleep design of a cat. So, and actually the sleep design of a human. Because we didn't have that.
Right.
And so when I went to 10 solar minutes, I found it.
Mm.
And so I ended up with 4 matrices. I also was downloaded the angelic matrix, which is the matrix, it's the emotional matrix, but I also call it the angelic because what I said to Ra is, Ra, you say a voice spoke to you. And I've had numinous experiences. Where does that show in the body graph? He didn't know. He said, the voice told me there's another matrix, but
Mm.
it didn't give it to him. So I said, okay, I think I'm getting it.
Mhm.
And lo and behold, ask and you shall receive. I was given the emotional matrix. And
Right.
what's so interesting about it is that it's a matrix that shows us how third dimensional reality is transformed into higher octave spirituality. And so once I got the calculations, I was sitting with Eric Mimmer because he would make trips and help me with my program and with what I needed. And so I was sitting with him one day and we were working on getting the additional calculation, and we kept working at it to see when my twins would show what they needed to show. And when I finally got it and I laid the 8 charts down on my desk, I went, holy, this shows it. Nothing else had shown it. Nothing else had explained my chart to me. Nothing else had shown me about my kids or my husband or clients. So I ended up looking at about 3,000 charts because I had all my clients' charts starting in 1973.
Mhm.
Remember, I was an astrologer. I had all of their astrological
You're
charts.
already tracking that kind of stuff, yeah?
So I did all of the charts, and all of my clients had asked me to do their human design chart. So I now did it with this new calculation, and it explained things that nothing else had explained, including their dreams.
Mhm.
Because I don't remember anything I say when I do a reading, and I generally don't remember what I've said in a session with a client.
Mm.
But I do remember my clients' dreams, and I do remember their stories.
Mm.
So when I looked at the charts, I was amazed. It showed me so much that nothing else showed.
Mhm.
And when I did a reading for my mentor astrologer, Catherine DeJersey, who at that point was um, close to 90, she had expected to die. She said to me, well, dear, do you think it's too late for me to learn how to do this? This
Mhm.
shows so much more. So, it's been a long journey. And once I got those charts, I began to notice, I began to work with an integrated chart. So, the work I do and what I came up with is that we have 4 worlds: mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical. That tracks to the 4 worlds in the Kabbalistic tree of life. The human design system did not actually integrate the paths of intelligence in the tree of life into the body map and what that means. It didn't integrate developmental critical periods in developmental life of a baby,
Right.
which when I looked at my calculations, exactly tracked what I knew developmentally as critical times. Now, a critical time in development is a time when you either get it or you don't. So, for example, if a baby doesn't learn to crawl before they learn to walk, they have visual issues that they need to remediate in order to not have learning disabilities. There are critical times. For example, for myself, I did have learning issues. And I said to a friend at one point, you know, I feel really stupid when I do an IQ test and I can't do 6 or 7 digits backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, oh, you have an auditory sequencing disorder. Come in, I'll solve it in 2 sessions. She did.
Mm-hmm.
But those kinds of things show up. And so auditory sequencing is a developmental process that comes in when you're about 6 or 7 years old. And if you don't get it and you miss it, you never get it again unless you go back and you
Let's go
remediate.
back to basics. Yeah.
So when I saw these early developmental times in my calculations, it was what we call in statistics consensual validation. In other words, when you independently come up with the same data through different fields and different ways of looking at it, you know it's true, it's reliable.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that my education at University of Chicago, I spent a year of studying developmental psychology with Larry Kohlberg, who was a disciple of Piaget, one of the bigs in developmental psych. I mean, you know, you look at it and you go, oh, okay, I have to integrate this. This
Mm-hmm.
is important developmental information. In fact, astrologically, progressions are based on exactly the calculations that I'm using in my noble energy mapping system.
Mm-hmm.
So I've integrated in noble energy maps all of the worlds. And when you take the prenatal and the postnatal, and if you think about it, a baby has volition when they're 3 months old. That's when, as a parent, you look for your baby to start reaching for things. Prior to that, they don't. But there are markers along the way. So, for example, at 2 days after birth, the milk comes down.
Mm-hmm.
When the milk comes down, that's when mother and baby attach. And the baby learns the mother's smell. They learns the physiology. So that's one of the calculations, is what cosmic influences were on you at that critical moment of attachment.
So you said something really important there. So I want to interrupt you for a second because I went for a walk with my friend Nathan, and I was talking about our conversations and about the different time stamps that you take into your calculations. And the one that I remembered was when the milk comes down. And his first comment, and it was a fair comment at the time, was what if the mother doesn't engage in breastfeeding or can't?
It doesn't
But
matter, the milk still comes down.
right, and what you said, but you already answered my question, but I just want to make sure others hear it, is like just even the smell from the mother, right? The vibe, the energy coming
Exactly.
is getting imprinted.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's just very interesting. So anyways, keep going. Sorry.
So, in other words, think about, and I actually did a program early on, and I have to see if it still works. I did an animated program of the all the calculations.
Hmm.
So you could see how things turn on and off with the cosmic energies.
Hmm.
But a week after birth is when spirit anchors. And we also have data for that. We have, in Judaism, we have the bris. In Aboriginal cultures, and this comes out of my anthropology background, we have cultures that don't name a baby for a week because they don't believe the spirit actually is anchored for that week. So we have independent confirmation of the timing. What I've noticed in many of my readings on the multidimensional is that many people need a week to mull over things before they know if something's right for them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't had a multidimensional reading from me, play it safe and never make a rash decision. Always wait and run it by spirit. So there's the different time frames, and the final time frame is 3 months after birth, and the manifestation process thus takes 3 months. So when you're thinking about goals, you want to think over a 3-month period, and that evolution of our design self-corrects.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not here to visualize and say, okay, this is what I want and I can't revise it. We're here to say, this is what I believe I want. Now let me listen to the feedback I'm getting from spirit, from the world, from my body, and from my emotions, and let me see if it still resonates.
Mm-hmm. You also said something really interesting another time, which is we basically experience the whole wheel in 3 months, which I think is kind of what you're correlating to, because, I think it's 6 months to walk the wheel, but because you said something about the earth and the moon
The
and
sun and the earth
the sun and
are
the
at
earth.
180 degrees.
Right.
So when you're born and we go 3 months back, roughly, that's a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes the next quarter by the time we're 3 months old.
So by
So
3 months old, you've experienced
the sun
all.
going through half and
Yeah.
the earth going through half. So at 3 months of age, we are designed to manifest our fullest potential.
Mm-hmm.
We are not here to be projectors or reflectors for the most part. We're here to use how we're energetically designed to manifest using our spirit, using our emotions, transforming emotional reactivity in the mental world spiritually through the 59-6.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
Hmm.
The 59-6 is a portal. Each world has portals. The central column in Eastern medicine known as the Satsuma, so the central vertical column, is very important in the tree of life. And the paths that come out of the self center in the tree are the same. There are 8, and there are 8 in the body map. So when you look at the paths that come out of the self center, what you're really looking at are paths of intelligence and consciousness for the person who has those gates or channels in their body graph. So when I'm reading a body graph, a body map, I'm looking at how conscious, how many of those gates and where do they fall in the tree of life, because that gives us a reading for where somebody is in their process of individuation. Carl Jung believed and wrote about the tree of life being a mirror for the process of individuation, meaning self-actualization. You start at the bottom in the 4 worlds, mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical. And you need to learn certain things along the path as you rise up the path with tests and challenges.
Hmm.
And finally, you come in touch with divinity of the self. So Carl Jung described the process, and in fact wrote a preface to the I Ching, the Wilhelm I Ching. So
The Wilhelm,
the original I Ching book
right?
by Wilhelm, and
Okay.
so the integration of these disciplines in the human design body graph need to be expanded with knowledge that Rod did not have.
Hmm. And seem disinterested in pursuing as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, mm,
So I know we've spent over an hour. You
mhm.
want to ask me some questions, and
Yeah.
then let's wind up for today and reconvene next week.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to do this again and just keep going. So a couple of things. Like I spent a lot of time in the human design space. I'm a busy guy. I track people on socials, and so the human design is just this big open mutation by itself, people running with it. And then there's infighting, even like just like if Ra didn't say it, it's not true, or people use the term like pop human design, and it's really getting mucky out there. One of the things that I imagine, like even just as I share this video, one of the first things will be like projectors won't like hearing that they might not be a projector, and I've even
Or
sampled that.
I disagreed with Ra in many of his descriptions
Mhm.
because in human design, I'm a manifester. 58, 18, 48, 16. But I kept saying to him, I don't feel like a manifester, and I'm not an angry type.
Mhm.
So for projectors, I always say you need to recognize what you feel as much as what other people project onto you.
Mhm.
You know, there's a lot more empowerment that can be built into your language than what Ra used.
Empowerment is the word of the week for me, and since I met you actually, and even how you and I connected. You know, I stumbled across your stuff probably 3 months ago, and
Mm.
then lost it, and then it appeared again, and then appeared again, and then I think I reached out to you, and then we met. We
You
had a reading.
asked you asked about getting the statistics.
Is that what I asked about? Okay,
Mm.
yeah. Yeah, I'm very interested in data. I seem to be like pattern matching seems to be my thing, and I mean, so many things you talked about today. Like when I think about, I feel like I'm going back through my entire life now and rechecking everything. Like if there's a sentence and a word stands out, I'm like, do I really understand that word? I like have to break from the conversation, go check it because I my trust was shaken through so many things, like just the beliefs I had, and it's been a very interesting time. So,
So the key question, Sean, for you to ask yourself, what do I know now? When that, what do I know now?
mhm.
And how is that different? Or what difference does it make? Those are clean questions. What I learned in the course of my evolution is that because we live in four worlds and we're not taught that we live in four worlds, and psychology only acts as though the mental world is real,
Mhm.
that my search for communication skills that would help my clients was because each world has its own specific language.
Mhm.
And so if you're doing inner work, you want to use clean language.
Mhm.
And actually, I sat in on somebody's therapy session this week, and I heard the therapist say, so what does that look like? Now, as a therapist, hypnotherapist, I would not ask one of my clients, what does that look like? I would say, and what do you know about that? Because not everybody is visual.
Hmm.
And the person who this therapist was sitting with is probably more kinesthetic than visual. So the answer is not going to be a complete answer
Hmm.
because you've asked a small piece of it. So as I've learned about the worlds and studied Kabbalah, I recognize that communication is world specific. And the skill it takes to know which world is which and which language to use is what I'm teaching people.
Hmm. Language is important for sure. There's the four agreements and be impeccable with your words. When I
Right?
heard that, I just knew instantly that I had to start changing my language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that a lot of people that have been in human design a long time, and in their case, it's more the raw stuff, I guess. But there is like I see them pause. They pause to choose the right word because they know intuitively that if they use the wrong word, the message might be heard wrong. It might not be misinterpreted. It might lead to problem down the line due to assumptions or so. Yeah,
But
like,
when you use the types only in the mental world,
mhm.
you're giving people partial information about themselves, and it's misleading.
It's disempowering, and that's kind of what And I'm be honest, and I think I told you this before. I'm still only about halfway through your book, and it's not even that thick. But each time I read something, like, oh man, I got to go check this out now, right? So I just keep like having to put it down, and so yeah, it's a real reset. It's kind of like shattered me a bit, like in a positive way, but it's really kind of taken me back to and maybe that's the manifesting generator, like skip steps and like, oh man, I got to go back to the beginning again. Like I really need to kind
Well,
of.
imagine me as a psychologist who realizes that most of my education in psychology did not include the reality of the spirit, and it didn't include a language for parents to talk to their children spiritually. uh, most when the human design system, they talk about the quote not self, and I've always said that doesn't mean anything to me.
Hmm.
uh, but the reason it doesn't mean anything to me is because as a parent and as a teacher to parents, I've always encouraged my clients to tune into the soul of their child.
Hmm.
In fact, to look to see if their child is seeing energy fields. So, you know, it's very hard to go back through my education as a therapist and realize, wait a minute, the reason certain therapies didn't work with certain people is using the wrong language
Hmm. Yeah.
and not giving the skills of that world.
Hmm. Yeah, and just think about how we met too, and I think what drew me to as well, like I again, I appreciate the tenacity of having to be that person doing punch cards. I missed that, but I knew people that were in IT, 5 years before I got in there, and they would talk about this, and I'd be like, oh man, I don't have the attention span or desire to do that.
But
And
it's so wonderful to do.
I bet it's probably sad. Well, it's probably satisfying because it was a physical process. Like and you had to go with intention. Like you had to book time to use this big computer, whose horsepower today would be 1/100th of what we have in our pockets, right? So we're just like forget that sometimes you need to put in the time. and energy. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that other than there's that. And then I've been like deeply interested in hypnosis, self hypnosis. I went and got trained, and as much as I've just kind of like acquired it as a skill, and I don't really know what I'll do with it, the power of repeating or planting positive aligning suggestions and what I understand from what you're doing is you also you're seeking the truth of the design. It comes from supported data, and then the last step, I believe, I guess, is part of it is like, let's play your tune by singing, playing your song, but and probably doing it in a hypnosis setting where you can plant it, anchor it in the unconscious, so that as you kind of go through your day, it's the
Well,
voice will steer itself a bit.
I think when people see their design and all the 8 charts that make it up, and I'd love to design. Um, I do have a coloring book, but I think it's useful to color your multidimensional chart
Hmm.
because you see where things turn on and off.
Hmm.
So, for example, um, I've said I'm a manifester, going up 58, 18, 48, 16, but in my spiritual, I get the sacral center. So I would often say, but wait a minute, Ra, I'm not a manifester. I wait and I wait and I wait and I wait. And then all of a sudden I know. And when I know because I know, that's when I act.
Hmm.
It's the sacral connecting up spiritually for me. And that, you have 4 charts active when you're born.
Hmm.
There's a composite when you're born of all of those worlds, and they turn on and off every day in you. The physical world, when the physical turns on, a baby cries and wants to be fed.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling visualizing all that. I've seen, like, when you showed me my charts, and so one of them is in the spiritual world. How do I interpret that in my day to day? Like, if I have a different design in spiritual versus emotional,
I'd have to
like,
look at it again and
hmm.
see exactly what turns on
Hmm.
and what gets activated that may not be in your mental world. And then think about for yourself what that might mean.
So it's kind of like a 4D body graph,
Yes,
right? Right? Or 3D chess or whatever. Like there is multiple dimensions here. And
yes.
then, so if I were to try to interpret it myself, if I was looking at my spiritual composite or body graph, that would be, when am I spiritual then? It like I'm always like, because when you're sleeping, that's a state, right? You're lying, you're in
Well,
that.
we move. Imagine that we're constantly in a wave,
Hmm.
and I talk a lot about the figure eight
Hmm.
because when um, my husband had heart surgery and was not able to breathe, I said to him, "Okay, go to bed, lay down in bed, and I will play Jim Gore's prayer, which I thought would release negative energy." And as I did that, I was standing at his bedside doing figure eights because we're Tai Chi Gong teachers.
Hmm.
So the figure eight is this, the infinity sign.
Hmm.
And as I was doing it, the voice said to me, "You know what this is.
Hmm.
This is your layout of your charts. You know what it is. You know how to read it. You need to make it public now."
Hmm.
But it's the 4 worlds, the mental, we're constantly in our life moving between worlds, mental to physical. So, how you think about your health, how you think about your body, how you think about your food is influenced and influences your mental state, your real world.
Mm-hmm.
From the physical, it goes to the spiritual. And then it goes to the emotional angelic. When you look at the matrices, there is no emotional solar plexus in the emotional angelic world. The solar plexus is only in the physical world and the mental world.
So because the solar plexus is an emotional center, but it doesn't
Exactly.
exist in the emotional world.
No. It
Okay.
exists. It has a portal
Mm-hmm.
that's emotional. So think about what that means. It means emotional reactivity only exists in the mental world,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, and that we're here as human beings to transform emotions into a higher octave of understanding and
Mm-hmm.
love.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very clear.
Mm-hmm. That seems like a good place to stop.
It does seem like a good place to stop. Uh,
Um, I'd like
a,
to do this
you know,
again, but yeah.
it's a big piece for people to take in and put their mind around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have 1,000 follow-up questions, but we can save that for another time.
Okay.
So I think what I'll do is we'll sign off now, and then I'm going to sneak in a conversation with you right after this because I want to
Okay.
talk more. So, but I'm going to hit end recording. I just want to thank you very much for hanging.